Hello, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World Talks. And to talk about the events of the past 4 years and the latest from Ukraine, we're joined by Andreas Umland, Policy Fellow at the European Policy Institute in Kyiv. Good afternoon.
Thanks for having me again.
Thank you for joining us. So, you've been with TVP World from the early days of the Russian invasion, if I remember it clearly, commenting on recent developments in and around Ukraine. How do you remember the very moment of invasion, and what were your thoughts then?
At this moment, I was in Stockholm and I was shocked, of course. And indeed, I was also skeptical on Ukraine's defense, although I had published before articles in which I warned that the war could happen and that it would not be the kind of war that Russia fought in 2008 in Georgia. So it was an unfortunate sort of realization of what I had earlier already feared, this escalation of the war that in fact began already in 2014 and then became a full-scale invasion.
So you said that at the beginning you doubted Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Now, when came the moment you realized that this war would last for long years?
Well, there were then these news about the failed attack on Kyiv and the apparently crucial fights that were happening close to Kyiv on the Hostomel airport, which is a military airport not far from Kyiv. And the plan was that Russian ground forces would occupy this airborne forces would occupy this this airport, and then Russian airplanes would land there and basically bring troops close to Kyiv and then capture Kyiv. And that didn't happen. There was a fight around this airport. And then it became clear that the planning was apparently not well done. And we had then these huge columns of vehicles, and that there was a total underestimation of the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian will to fight.
So here we are, 4 years later. The war of attrition, as a matter of fact, is taking place in Ukraine, and Ukraine is not only defending itself, but it also bites back at its aggressor. Now, what do you think of Ukraine's strikes against the Druzhba pipeline? Can Kyiv afford nowadays for the EU packages to be blocked by Slovakia and Hungary?
The odd thing is here, of course, that this pipeline is going partly through Ukraine, and that the question is here, who is responsible for what in concerning this pipeline. And what we have now is a situation in which these countries, Hungary and Slovakia, are insisting that this Russian oil is important for their survival. But of course, the problem here is that not only is the Russian oil flowing into these countries, but also these countries are paying for this oil, and these payments for that oil are important for the Russian budget, for the war budget. So that is an odd situation. Slovakia and Hungary had 4 years to deal with that, and they have not done so. And now they are basically getting the bill, so to say, for their failed foreign economic policies. At wartime, to simply continue this trade as if nothing had happened was an unwise policy, and now it's come to this escalation in the Slovak Ukrainian and Hungarian-Ukrainian relations.
Well, the escalation is there, no doubt about it. The EU failed to adopt the 20th sanctions package against Russia yesterday, mostly due to Hungary's and then Slovakia's veto, of course. Now, can the collective West look for different ways to pressure Russia if these particular interests win with the continent's overall security?
That's a good question. In a way, that is a key question of Western policies that has always been the problem since 2014 in these Western signals towards Russia, that these private interests, national interests, company interests are taken into account, and then the reaction of the West to these violations is muted, inconsistent, and then creating in Moscow the impression that it can get with these violations of international law. And one should mention here that there were other, of course, violations of international law by other countries. But what we have here since 2014 are annexations. That is something unusual after 1945, outright annexation of territory that is not punished, as happened with Kuwait in 1991, when Iraq had annexed Kuwait, and then Kuwait was liberated. And we have now also, since 2022, more and more signs of genocide happening in Ukraine, for instance, through the deportation of children. And that is also something that is an extraordinary violation of international law that has become uncommon, let's put it that way, since 1945.
Right. Now, something unthinkable in terms of, in legal terms, as you have mentioned, and not only in the international law, but in domestic domestic circumstances that are happening right now in Ukraine. Now, what do you think of General Valery Zaluzhny's recent comments on his offices being raided to intimidate him when he was still the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's army? Now, is this the beginning of an election campaign in Ukraine? And if so, maybe General Zaluzhny knows something that we don't know, and maybe the end of the war is closer than we think.
I would certainly hope so, that it will go this way, and that the war will soon be over. I partly live in Kyiv, and therefore had the opportunity to experience these Russian air attacks on Ukraine numerous times. But I don't think that this is yet a sign of the end of the war. There may be indeed political bickering ongoing, and Zaluzhny is now, if he would go into politics, if he would become a presidential candidate, the most serious alternative contender, and perhaps somebody who could win against Zelensky. And it would be indeed a pity if now Zelensky and the SBU and the current government is using these sort of administrative measures against a political opponent. That is not typical, or let's put it that way, that is not something that Ukraine has been aspiring for. We had earlier these repressions under Yanukovych, but it would be sad if now the current government would act in a similar way.
Right. Now, about the end of the war, whether it's close or very distant, now Ukrainians claim that more Russian soldiers die and get wounded on battlefields than Moscow is actually able to mobilize. Now, does this mean that this vast country, Russia, is running out of its biggest resource, that is manpower?
Russia has not yet introduced full mobilization, unlike Ukraine. And so far as I understand, most or even all of the Russian soldiers who are on the front are there more or less voluntarily. Usually they are sort of seduced to come to the front line with huge payments. And when they then realize that this is a one-way ticket, at the front, it's sort of too late, and then they cannot easily leave, and would then actually perhaps run the risk of being shot by their own people if they desert. So it's not entirely comparable to the Ukrainian situation, and the question is whether the Kremlin would be ready to announce full and compulsory mobilization. Then, of course, it could recruit more men, but that would also mean probably domestic tension and perhaps even domestic disturbances in Russia, and that is apparently what is holding Putin back, at least so far.
Right, now we've already discussed these tensions between Ukraine and EU countries, I mean Hungary and Slovakia. But do you think that in the end Kyiv will get the 90 billion EU aid package?
I hope that the EU will find a way around this sort of veto from Hungary, and basically, as far as I understand, there was already an agreement that these three countries, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, would not be part of the of this deal. And so I was a bit surprised when I now heard that Hungary has apparently still some sort of veto on that. But I guess this will be resolved somehow. I'm more worried about the sanctions package because there is a methodology in the adoption of these sanctions packages which still requires a full consensus of all the EU member countries. And here there could indeed then be a problem with Hungary's veto.
Andreas Umland, Policy Fellow at the European Policy Institute in Kyiv, was our guest this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me again.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for more news and interviews here on TVP World.